Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Passages Pulse. At the time of this recording, it is Wednesday, September 10th, 2025. It is 10 a.m. Eastern Time at the time of this recording. My name is Sebastian. I'm here with my co-host Josiah. Josiah McGee, how are you? How you doing?
I'm good. It's been a really crazy week, though. I mean, it's been, just a wild turn of events, bit of a roller coaster. So I think it's going to be an interesting conversation today.
Yeah, it has been a dramatic week in the Middle East. Lots happening. For instance, there was a wave of suicide drones sent by the Houthis terrorists from Yemen to Israel. There was a mass shooting in Jerusalem on Monday at a bus station. On Tuesday, also, Israel launched an airstrike against Hamas leaders in Qatar. So we're going to talk about in this episode, why are all these things happening now? What does the timing have to do with anything? What does it all mean? So let's get started. Let's start with what happened in Qatar first. Israel launched 10 munitions from Israeli Air Force jets on a private building in the capital, Doha of Qatar. The target was a group of senior Hamas leaders who are kind of pretty much based there. Josiah, what was Israel trying to accomplish with this airstrike?
Yeah, great question. Well, the target, as you said, was a group of senior Hamas leaders. I'm going to put a picture up here for those of you who are following along on YouTube of some of these individuals. It was essentially a goal to take out some leaders of Hamas who formed two specific groups or collectives. One being that these individuals basically operated as the chief negotiating team, the team that was negotiating with Israel and the United States through the mediation of the Qataris for a ceasefire deal and return of the hostages. They also formed essentially the senior leadership council of Hamas that was put in place to run the organization following the assassination of different leaders last year, like Hania, Sinwar, individuals who were basically the top guy within Hamas. Israel took out last year, and so they formed, rather than naming a successor, formed a council, if you will, of individuals who would jointly continue to run the operation or run the organization of Hamas. So the target was some of these individuals. These individuals were responsible for a variety of different things. You can see, for example, top right, Khalil al-Hayya was one of the chief negotiators. In the top middle, you see Khaled Mishal, who's been a legendary figure within Hamas for many decades. You also see individuals here who are responsible for running different political councils or running the West Bank branch of the organization. So these really are the top five guys, if you will, who had been participating in these negotiations and running the organization for about a year now, following some of those assassinations last year. Now, it is worth noting that these individuals all primarily run the organization or lead the organization from a position in exile. So they live, most of these individuals, either in Qatar or in Turkey, depending on the time of year and what they're meeting for. Yesterday, they all happened to be together, presumably to discuss the latest negotiation proposal from the United States. So some of them had flown from Turkey to Qatar for that purpose, but they all live abroad. None of them actually live in Palestinian territories or in the Gaza Strip, where Hamas has been fighting Israel for the last almost 2 years now. They essentially exist in function to try to represent Hamas on the international stage. So none of these individuals are directly responsible for what happens in the Gaza Strip, but they do oversee the organization to a certain degree, and even that which happens in the Gaza Strip. I'll explain that in a moment. Their primary function, however, is to try to represent Hamas on the international stage, to try to create some legitimacy, some credibility for the organization, to try to normalize the organization in the international community as something other than just a terror organization, but try to make it appear as a political organization, to negotiate for the organization's ability to function as a political organization recognized by the international community, to try to overcome things like international sanctions because they are a terror organization, and to try to basically create a world in which people would actually accept them as a legitimate leader of the Palestinians, not as the terror organization that they actually are. So a big part of their function essentially is to conduct diplomacy, to fundraise from countries like Qatar to support the operations of Hamas, raise the money that it needs and to try to create this brand essentially for the organization Hamas. Now, what I referenced a moment ago is that they are not directly involved in the day-to-day operations in the Gaza Strip, but they do play some role, of course, in what happens in the Gaza Strip. So Hamas is a very interesting organization. If you're not very familiar with it, you might not know this, that it silos itself pretty strictly. A lot of that is for the purpose of security, of course, so that not every branch of Hamas knows what every other branch of Hamas is doing. And there are many branches or departments within the organization. That being said, part of why they also do that is so that they can create the appearance or the illusion that some of these individuals are primarily political figures and not terrorists, because they're not involved in the day-to-day operations of the fighting that takes place in the Gaza Strip. What I do want to clarify is that, in truth, each of these individuals worked very closely with the leaders in the Gaza Strip, those who were actually planning the October 7 operation and the war sense. And a lot of that is because they function as an organization within a consensus model. The idea being that, yes, the specific decisions about when and where and how to fight in the Gaza Strip or how to conduct terrorism against Israel is primarily made by local leaders on the ground, but within the structure that's been created by the organization's consensus model. Basically, what that means is that even after October 7, leaders who have since passed, like Khania, stated that they were not directly ordering October 7 to happen, but the military wing of Hamas carried out October 7 in accordance with or in alignment with the principles that had been laid out or established by the political bureau of the organization. So each of these individuals bears some responsibility for October 7, even if they were not present during the fighting on October 7. And Israel basically argued these individuals are responsible, at least in part, for October 7, because they've created the rules for Hamas, the goals for Hamas that were then led to the October 7 attacks. They have sabotaged various peace deals to this point by not agreeing to deals that they indicated that they would, or making demands after deals have already been agreed to in principle. Israel's argument essentially is that these people have to go. They're responsible for October 7, so they have to be held accountable. They've been sabotaging these different peace deals we've been trying to reach since, which again means that they need to be held accountable, and they're an obstacle to peace that has to be removed. And we also can't allow them to continue to engage in the propaganda war that Hamas has been carrying out for the last 2 years, trying to frame itself as anything other than a terror organization, which it is at heart, a terror organization. So hypothetically, to boil this all down and to summarize what I've probably just made sound very complicated, there's 3 goals for what Israel was trying to accomplish in attacking the site where these individuals were meeting. 1, to weaken Hamas's ability to politically organize and to more thoroughly defeat the organization, because Israel has made it clear in recent months their goal is not just to defeat Hamas military wing, but also to defeat it as a political organization that cannot reconstitute itself and a military wing down the road. 2, to hold the perpetrators for October 7 responsible, including those who were overseeing the organization from abroad in places like Turkey and Qatar. And 3, to break the negotiations stalemate. Now, I'm not totally sold, Sebastian, that all those goals are actually realistic. Maybe we'll get into that in a few minutes. But aspirationally, if you just listen to what the Israelis are saying as the justification for this airstrike, those are the big 3 goals that they've laid out in terms of why they chose to take this approach.
Well, Josiah, I think it's outrageous, first of all, that in the world allows a terror organization to have like a diplomatic wing. As far as I'm concerned, I don't know any other terrorist organization that has been given that privilege. I don't think there were Al-Qaeda people who were meeting with politicians.
I mean, the Taliban is a fairly analogous example.
I guess, yes, that's a good point. Yeah, the Taliban who rules Afghanistan today, they have, I mean, they're the government. They rule this country. So, but I mean, it's just part of the hypocrisy of the Arab and Muslim world in Turkey and Qatar giving safe haven to these terrorist leaders. Basically, I want to highlight 2 things before we move in. So, thank you for explaining what Israel was trying to do, why Israel was trying to do it. We're going to talk about in a second, did it succeed or not? Before we do that, I want to highlight just 2 things about these people. Thank you for putting the picture up. Khaled Mashal, the guy in the middle with the kafia. Israel also tried assassinating before, right? In 1990, 7, Netanyahu was prime minister. They tried to assassinate him in Jordan, but he failed. His bodyguards caught the Israeli spies who were operating under Canadian passports. They captured them, they gave them to Jordanian authorities. In order to get them back, Israel had to give the antidote for this guy and also give away Sheikh Yassin, right? One of the leaders, the founders of Hamas. So it was a
The founder.
botched operation, right? Yeah, the guy that I just referred is the famous white beard guy that's on a wheelchair because Israel tried to assassinate him before too. So this is the second time when I saw this happening. We were actually in team meeting yesterday at Here Passages, and when I saw this, I thought Israel had to be so sure that it was going to succeed in order to risk all the political fallout that was going to come. But it doesn't seem like it. The second thing I want to highlight before we go to see if he was successful is the other guy that you had right next to Khaled Mashal. He has said some terrible things after October 7th, and I have some of his quotes. His name is Khalil Al-Haya. He has said things like, what occurred on October 7th is a miraculous military and security achievement. This is a source of pride for our people. I will post the link to the video. Memory is an organization that translates from Arabic what these people say. So he's a guy who was calling for another day of, Khaled Mashal also was calling for a day of jihad. They're saying that this is a miraculous security achievement. We're miraculous military. So I just wanted to say this so everybody understands. They're not politicians. They're not just nice people trying to get aid into Gaza. They're terror leaders. They're leaders of a terrorist organization, and that's why they're a legitimate target. So, just with that being said, can you tell us what appears to be the facts after the operation? Did it succeed or not?
I wouldn't say that there's much that is factually known at this point. And that's part of the challenges. We're recording this, I would say, about 24 hours after we initially became aware of the news, but there's a lot of very clouded information about what happened since. So I'll just very briefly throw another picture up if people want to see where this attack took place. And what you're going to see here is an example of why this is so complicated. Now, you have a building here where the individuals were staying or meeting supposedly, and you have a picture here of not just the damage, but also a lot of the vehicles surrounding it right now. What are those vehicles? Well, those vehicles are primarily belonging to the Qatari security forces. What you don't see in this picture is what happened shortly after they arrived on scene is that they brought a bunch of bulldozers in because they had to start excavating the rubble. This wasn't just a hole in the wall, it was a hole in the ground essentially that has to be dug out in order to determine who are all the bodies, identify all the bodies appropriately, and then determine who was actually killed as a result of this airstrike. Initially, Israel said that they thought that they had killed everyone. They were confident that they had eliminated the 5 individuals that they thought were there and were trying to eliminate. There was a lot of contradictory information coming from Hamas, of course. Hamas, not surprising that they're always going to deny the elimination of any of their leaders, even if they have actually been killed. It took them quite a long time to acknowledge the loss of Sinwar after he was killed in the Gaza Strip. So it's not surprising that they would be denying that Israel actually successfully killed anyone in this airstrike. The challenge is that you also have alternative sources from Arab media claiming that the bodies that were quickly identified were of associates or employees of assistants to the different individuals who were the actual targets. You also have reports from a lot of these Arab media sources saying that they don't believe any of the top 5 were actually killed. You have Israel even this morning saying, doesn't look good. We're actually not sure 24 hours after the fact if we actually took out any of the top 5. So the long and short of it is it's really unclear at this point whether or not they actually succeeded in taking out the targets that they had identified. I think the challenge then is if you didn't eliminate the top 5, Israel's already spinning this as a moral victory of sorts by claiming essentially that they've broken through this imaginary barrier, psychological barrier in which Israel could not attack Qatar, or Hamas had always felt safe and always should feel safe in the sanctuary that Qatar had provided for Hamas leaders. And Israel's argument basically is, even if we didn't destroy the entire leadership council, or even if we didn't eliminate all 5 or any of the 5, it's still a victory in the sense that we've given them reason to fear for their lives and proven that they shouldn't feel safe in Qatar, yada, yada. I don't necessarily think that is a good enough victory for what it cost Israel to launch an airstrike against Qatar. Again, we can maybe debate that point a little bit later on, Sebastian. But it should be clear that the initial goals laid out for the operation have not been met if they didn't actually eliminate the top 5. So, you can change the goalposts and argue that it was a success, but if you're sticking to the original goals or reasons why you would carry out an attack like this, no, it was not a success if they were unable to actually eliminate those top 5. I think you have to just keep in mind that, even if they did take out those top 5 as well, I just want to remind the audience that there is a pretty long history of Israel assassinating leaders of organizations like Hamas, and then those organizations finding a way to reconstitute themselves, to reorganize politically. So even if they did actually take out the top 5, and it's just going to take us a few days or even a couple of weeks to confirm that, that doesn't necessarily mean that Hamas is dead as an organization.
Yeah.
It also does not mean that the hostages are coming out in the near future, because now Israel has to wait for Hamas to reorganize itself and figure out who they're negotiating with for the hostages. So it's complicated. The long and short of it basically is we still don't know if they actually succeeded. And even if they did, immediate success or return on the operation in terms of seeing hostages come home or things like that is probably not going to happen. It's going to take some time for it to become clear whether or not this operation actually succeeded tactically and strategically in terms of those big goals or long-term goals they laid out for the operation.
Yeah, at the very least, it sends a message to these leaders that they're not safe anywhere. They thought they were safe in Qatar. They had immunity there. I don't think Israel would risk another diplomatic fallout to do another attack. We'll see. I want to say some things about Qatar, but before we do that, I want to ask you questions. I guess the theory is by eliminating these guys who are living abroad, who seem to be the more stubborn leaders. So you did your dissertation on Hamas. Do you think that if they were able to eliminate these people living abroad, these billionaires living abroad in the comfort of these palaces where they live, the people, whoever's in charge of Hamas in Gaza, would be more likely to do an agreement soon?
Unlikely. Because the challenge is there's always been this interesting divide between what's referred to as the Gaza leadership and the external leadership, or leadership in exile, in terms of their priorities, their goals. For I think fairly evident reasons, the leadership in Gaza is primarily concerned with 2 things. 1, surviving, and 2, resistance against Israel. The ideological purity within the organization, the origins of the organization's ideology, this idea of resisting against Israel, really were born out of the Gaza Strip and some of the communities in the Gaza Strip. So really that's where you continue to find the most ideologically hardened individuals within the organization, continues to be inside the Gaza Strip, in the military wing of Hamas that operates within the Gaza Strip. The external political leadership has always been a little bit more, I don't want to say, let's just to say pragmatic, I think is a good term, because they are still leading a terrorist organization. So I don't want to whitewash that reality. Yeah. But at the same time, they have been a little bit more politically pragmatic, a little bit more concerned with image and trying to present the right image to the international community, to normalize the organization in the international community. Like I said, a little bit more diplomacy focused than the leadership in Gaza has been, which is very hard line.
So from your assessment, the people in Gaza are more intransigent than the people abroad?
Absolutely.
Okay, like
eliminating these leaders. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's been assumed for the last 2 years that the primary obstacles, that they're all obstacles to the negotiations for the ceasefire or the hostages. The worst obstacles, the hardest to move obstacles, were people like Sinwar, not Khalil Haya or Mishal or other individuals who are leading from abroad. So eliminating, even if they did eliminate these top 5, I don't think that translates to an easy to reach hostage deal, because people in Gaza want a deal more. They don't. They're probably less likely actually to accept a deal than the leaders who were living abroad.
Well, like I said, I want to say some things about Qatar, but we'll get to that in a second. Let's talk about the timing though. So when I started the introduction, we talked about all these things happening: Houthis, suicide drone attacks, Jerusalem terror attack. So tell us about why this is all happening this week. What does the timing say about all this, Josiah?
Well, I think in terms of the big picture of why are some of these terror attacks happening, you have to keep in mind that the operation in Gaza City is starting to ramp up. So Israel's not just threatening to attack Gaza City, which is a major symbol of Hamas leadership and control and resistance in the Gaza Strip, it is actually doing it. Israel's actually launching airstrikes on different buildings in Gaza City that they believe are controlled by Hamas. They're issuing mass evacuation orders, basically telling all the civilians you have to leave because we're going to invade Gaza City. And that has Hamas and other actors in the region, I think, on very high alert. The Houthis would definitely fall into that camp. What happened during the attack was essentially two men from the West Bank who Hamas claims as members of their organization, the West Bank branch of the organization, carried out a mass shooting attack in Jerusalem on Monday. And that's very, very important context. Again, I think that probably is because tensions are so high regarding the looming invasion of Gaza City. But you also can't divorce Israel's attack on Qatar from that context. Israel's attack on Qatar was in part justified because of this mass shooting attack in Jerusalem. Is looking at the situation saying, okay, we're laying out demands for a ceasefire. If Hamas does not want us to invade Gaza City, Hamas is not meeting our demands. They're being very stubborn about it. Not only are they not meeting our demands, but they're taking the fight not just from the Gaza Strip, they're taking it to Jerusalem itself, to civilians in Jerusalem, and shooting up buses in Jerusalem. That's unacceptable. That level of terrorism is unacceptable when we are supposedly trying to negotiate a ceasefire deal. So Israel's going to use that as justification in part for the attack on the leaders abroad in Qatar, especially because, again, keep in mind, it was two members of the West Bank branch of Hamas that carried out that attack on Jerusalem. One of the five in Qatar that was targeted was the leader of the West Bank branch of Hamas. That, I think, is part of why Israel decided this is the moment. There are additional moments, I think, additional reasons why Israel thought that this was the moment, not just the terror attacks, not just the position that Hamas had taken in the negotiations. The fact that the leaders had refused to disarm and leave Gaza was a big deal. Also, the fact that Israel has long despised the fact that they feel comfortable, waiting out the war, dragging it out as long as possible because they have sanctuary in a place like Qatar. Israel thought that that really needed to be dealt with, and so they just felt like this was all coming together. And at the end of the day, it also just comes down to an opportunity. Israel does not very often have an opportunity to put all five Hamas leaders that they want to eliminate in the same room. When they saw a window of opportunity when they would all be in the same room, they decided, okay, now's our chance, and this is why we're going to take this opportunity.
Yeah, one thing to follow on the fallout of the shooting attack in Jerusalem is the reports that I've been hearing of how Israel plans to punish the families and the people who committed this terror attack. I think we're going to come back to that, so let's put a pin on that. We'll keep following how Israel will respond. Usually Israel goes and demolishes the homes of the terrorists who do an attack like this. So we'll keep up with that because I'm sure it'll come up in the news soon. One more story from that attack. As I read a report online from one of the volunteers who responded to this thing, they're called United Hatzalah. And the guy who came, he was trying to respond to the bus driver of the bus. His name was Mohammed. He was an Arab Israeli driver of the bus. Maybe he was an East Jerusalem resident. I don't know. But the point is, when terror people just open fire in Jerusalem, you're not choosing between Christian, Jews, tourists, or whatever. These were Muslim terrorists attacking a Muslim driver. Mohammed was the driver. So it just highlights how terror does not discriminate when it comes to Jerusalem and cities like that. So, well, Josiah, we talked about the timing. Let's talk about the implications. So, like I said earlier, if Israel were going to take this risk, it's because they were going to be sure that it was going to be successful, because the fallout was going to be very messy. So what are the implications so far?
I mean, it depends in part on what comes out as far as what actually happened, how successful it was or not. I think some of the implications are not going to be clear for a little bit of time yet. Initially, I think there are a few implications that we can already begin to unpack a little bit. Number one, just based on what we know about the initial events and what happened after, Qatar is not out of the picture. Okay, Israel might want Qatar to be out of the picture, but they're not in this instance. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they are an ally of the United States. We have a major military base in Qatar. Consider them to be a political and military ally in the Middle East. The exact sequence of events is a little bit confusing. The United States did not get advance notice that this was going to happen, and then when they found out, they warned the Qataris. I think just given what we know about the US's placement in the Middle East, the amount of hardware, military hardware it has there, surveillance capabilities that they have there, it would be very surprising if they did not know ahead of time that this was likely going to happen. So
Yeah, by
more
the way,
likely than
Josiah,
not.
in order for Israel to do this, they had to fly through Iraq. So the United States will find out because we have a base in Iraq. Right?
Probably. I mean, rumor is basically what happened is that the US picked up Israeli fighter jets on radar, called them, and basically said, "What's going on?" Israel told them, "We're on our way to Qatar." And the US turned around and then called Qatar to say, this is about to happen. It's disputed whether or not the US called the Qataris before or after the attack happened and gave them warning. Who knows? After the events, the president tried to save face by arguing essentially that he did not approve this operation, that he was mad at Israel for doing this unilaterally without coordinating with the United States because Qatar is an ally, so on and so forth. He also said, at the same time, he's kind of doublespeak a little bit, said something to the effect of, this shouldn't have happened. It's unfortunate, but it does perhaps create an opportunity for peace. So he was mad at Israel, but he also wasn't mad at Israel. And what it kind of looks like is that he was basically trying to save face a little bit, trying to give the Qataris an out or a way to de-escalate by not embarrassing the Qataris and making it appear that he was scolding Israel and had the Qataris back in this instance. But at the same time, was basically telling Israel, don't do it again, but also I'm not that mad that you tried to do this. At the end of the day, though, what it comes down to is if Israel's expecting the Qataris to bow out of the picture, to immediately expel Hamas leadership or refuse to mediate between Hamas and Israel moving forward, for about 2 hours, I would say maybe, it appeared that might be the case. And then due to some pressure from the White House, the Qataris pretty quickly, before yesterday was over, made a statement basically saying, we're not going to step back. We're going to continue to be an active player in the mediation between Israel and Hamas and trying to find an end to the war. So that's implication number one. At the end of the day, there was a lot of political drama, but the status quo doesn't really change that much in terms of Qatar's role in the conflict and the role that it plays between Israel and Hamas. Now, I have more implications, Sebastian, or more thoughts, but do you want to pause there and say something?
I want to reference an article that I hope we can link in the article. It's from in our episode note. It's from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. It was published in July by a friend of Passages with whom we collaborated. Her name is Natalie Econo, and she's a senior research analyst. And the title of the article is "A Reckoning is Needed Between Terror Sponsoring Qatar and the United States." Because this is really awkward. As you said, Qatar is supposedly an ally of the United States, but Qatar is actively funding anti-American values in American universities. They're sponsoring terror networks. They're harboring Qatar. We should say, and this will take too long to explain at this moment, that Qatar was giving money to Hamas under an agreement approved by the United States and Israel. They thought that this was going to help, and obviously it backfired on Netanyahu. But I want to say one thing. When Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in 2006, the Qatari prime minister was the first leader to go visit them. And in this article, Natalie lays out how there are quotes, documents saying from Ismail Haniyeh, the guy that Israel killed in Iran last year, saying that the emir has personally pledged for the funding of the Hamas leadership. He said he pledged 11 million already. And Qatar is he calls it the main artery for fundraising. So Qatar basically allows banking institution and banking people to operate within the Qatari financial system to transfer money to Hamas people through nonprofit organizations, things like that. So Qatar is not innocent here. Qatar supports terror. They're not our friend. This is my opinion here. This is not Passage's position or anything like that. I think we should do what we can from the American position to shift away from Qatar, that is not a friend, that is funding the destruction of America, into more friendly allies such as the United Arab Emirates, for instance. So I just want to highlight how complicated Qatar is, and hopefully we'll link the article by the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.
Yeah, just to elaborate on that very briefly, Sebastian, I think what makes this such an interesting gray area for Israel in terms of whether or not Qatari territory is a legitimate target. Really, it's unclear within the confines of international law because it's a bit of a gray area. There is an assumption within international law that conflicts are supposed to be fought between state actors, so between countries, not between countries and organizations that are not recognized politically. Obviously, given the rise of so many non-state actors who are violent, international law has some gaps that still need to be filled in terms of how war is meant to be fought between a country and an organization, like a war between Israel and Hamas. There is a little bit of international legal precedent spelled out in terms of what you're supposed to do if you're choosing to launch an attack against a country that you are not at war with, but is harboring an organization that you are at war with. In theory, you're not supposed to do that if you are simply allowing them to live within your territory. So if all the Qataris were doing was allowing Hamas to live in Doha, leaders to live in Doha, then Qatari territory really shouldn't be touched by Israel, even if Hamas is a terrorist organization. The exception is if the Qataris are somehow, quote unquote, substantially involved in the operations of Hamas in supporting them in some way. Then, in theory, there is justification to violate Qatari sovereignty by carrying out an attack like what Israel did on Tuesday. Now, the problem is that the definition of substantial involvement is not very clearly spelled out. That's one of those gaps that I referred to in international legal precedent, that it's not very clear what counts as substantially involved in Hamas's operations. Is it the funding that the Qataris provide? Is it something else, like actually coordinating with them and joint planning of operations? There's a lot of gray area there that just hasn't been clarified really. So I think it's worth noting that that's part of why there's so much debate online today about what happened, is that it's not black and white about what you're supposed to do in a situation like this.
One benefit that Israel had in this operation is that Qatar is like this little, literally. Look it up in the map, y'all. So when Israel went in, they didn't have to come into Qatari airspace because they had 10 IF Israeli Air Force jets, fired 1 munition each, so 10 munitions total, but they didn't enter Qatari airspace. But yes, it's a violation of Qatari's sovereignty. And I think you're going to talk about that next. But what if Israel succeeded, Josiah?
Yeah, so I mean, some additional things we have to think about, I suppose, in terms of what does this mean? And I'll give a couple of hypotheticals. One, if we pretend that this attack actually succeeded. One, we pretend that it did not, because we still don't know. The next thing I think we have to think about is that regardless, it doesn't really matter if it is succeeded or not. The ceasefire for the hostages is probably farther away. And this is something that you're already seeing some pretty strong opinions about from the families of hostages in Israel who responded to the attack with very complicated emotions. Because on the one hand, yes, you want to hold the perpetrators for October 7 accountable. On the other hand, this makes it significantly less likely that they'll see their loved ones in the near future, or that a deal will be reached. Because if Hamas's leadership survive this attack, they don't really have a strong incentive to talk to Israel right now or to try to reach a deal, because Israel just tried to kill them. If Hamas's leadership did not survive the attack, if they all were killed by this attack, then, as we've already mentioned, leaders in Gaza typically, historically, have tended to be actually more ideologically extreme, more stubborn, harder to work with. So either way, unfortunately, I would say one of the implications is that it doesn't really bode well for the hostages. The next thing I want to also mention as well is that, let's pretend for a moment, one of our hypotheticals is that Israel's attack did actually succeed and eliminated the top 5 leaders. If that's true, Hamas experts are going to have to, not entirely, but a little bit kind of start over, because those who've been studying the organization for decades have been studying the same individuals, largely for decades, have been running the organization. You referenced, it's back in the 90s, there was an attempt to assassinate Mishal. He's legendary. He's a legendary figure who's been around for many decades. Some of these guys are getting older, but they've been in power for a very long time. If all of them were actually eliminated, then that means that a new generation is likely going to rise. My guess is that they probably will be even more extreme as a result of the experience of October 7, the return on investment that they seem to be getting out of it in terms of their international prestige, popularity, the momentum against Israel right now in the international community, the idea that a Palestinian state might be created, and also just the suffering that Palestinians have experienced in Gaza. More than likely, the people who are going to rise to the top, if there is a new generation of leaders coming, are going to be even more extreme than the old generation. So that's worth thinking about. If you're a student of Hamas or someone who studies the organization, it's not like they're going to start from scratch, but they are going to have to, if this attack succeeded, reconstitute themselves fairly quickly. And there are probably going to be some names people are a little bit less familiar with that are going to, maybe not immediately, but in the next few years, start to be given more and more responsibility. And those people, I would assume, my guess at the moment is that there's going to be even more extremism as a result of that transition in leadership. Last thing I wanted to mention. Let's pretend now that this did not succeed. One of our hypotheticals is that this didn't actually work. We don't know that right now. But if that's the case, a violation of Qatari sovereignty, like what you saw yesterday, that does not result in a clear outcome that favors Israel in terms of having actually accomplished its goals, comes at a very high cost. Israel's already suffering a bit of a PR crisis internationally. Diplomatically, it is not very well received at the moment. You can identify examples in the past where attacks like this have been worth it, worth even the criticism. A great example, I think, would be the U.S. raid in Pakistan that killed bin Laden. Came at a high cost, but it was worth it because the United States killed the man responsible for 9/11. These types of things typically are only worth it, though, if they actually succeed. If it didn't succeed, Israel's probably going to pay a very high price for very little in return. And that's something that it's going to have to wrestle with in the next few weeks and months is, okay, where do we go from here if we've just spent a significant amount of political capital on an attack that didn't succeed? Now what? How do you restore some of that credibility, some of that trust that Israel's been building over the last 2 years, or trying to build over the last 2 years through its various military operations, taking out its different enemies? So just food for thought. And, Sebastian, I'd be curious for some of your thoughts on this. I'm sure you have thoughts as well, because this is a big deal, this operation, and whether it worked or not. But what do you think?
Yeah, my one last thought on this whole fallout thing. We already seen the European Union trying to retaliate against Israel economically, trying to downgrade trade ties with Israel. You just talked about how the United States, did the same in Pakistan to get bin Laden. I think Israel is trying to get the head of the people behind the worst murder of Jews since the Holocaust in a single day. And it's a shame that the Western world is not standing with Israel in its fight against terror. I think the reason why, and this is my theory once again, here goes Sebastian's theorizing. I think the reason why is European Union has a lot of economic ties to Qatar. So in London, if you go, Qatar owns a lot of real estate there, a lot of financial institutions depend on Qatari money. European countries are overloaded with bloated budgets, trying to pay all their entitlements that they give away, free healthcare, free education, all these things. They have low birth rates, so they're selling their soul to Qatari money because, think about Paris and Macron's ties to Qatar. So this is, again, my theory is that the reason why they're doing all this because Qatar gives them money and they want to keep Qatar happy. I don't think we saw anybody severing ties with the United States because we can't kill bin Laden because Pakistan was not giving them money. So I think this is all about the money. And it's a shame, once again, I say, that the Western world is not standing with Israel in its fight against terrorism. We'll see, the fallout, what will happen. But now, because we have a great benefit in all of this, y'all, when the world seems to be dealing with these really difficult situations, as Christians, we get to pray and thank God for that, because we don't live, this is not an ultimate reality. What's going on in the world is important and we should be educated and involved. But thank God that we know what the ultimate reality is. We know who is in charge. We know that God is sovereign. Let's talk about that. How should Christian respond, Josiah? What are you thinking on that end?
Yeah, I think, again, to go back to something we said last week, it's important not to overreact. I think it's important to be patient as Christians because we don't know how much information is yet to come out or what we're missing, what pieces of the puzzle we're missing right now. So I think it's important not to overreact until we actually know what happened in the attack, how successful it was or not. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if we assume that it did succeed, okay, what should our response be? In that case, it's an interesting question about how you respond to the destruction of evil that requires the taking of a human life. Within the just war theory tradition, there is ample thought that has gone into, and very, very careful thought that's gone into, what is the moral case for the taking of a life. The just war theory within the Christian tradition especially does reason its way to the idea that it is acceptable to take a life in the pursuit of justice or the destruction of evil. At the same time, it doesn't celebrate the taking of a life. It views it as not morally impermissible, but still something that could be considered morally injurious is another term that's often thrown out there. The idea being that it's not impermissible, but it's not something that we should glorify or celebrate. It still does some damage to the soul, even if it is necessary to take a human life in order to save other lives or to destroy evil. So I think we need to be very thoughtful about that. When we see things like this happening, yes, we can appreciate the fact that justice has been done. We should celebrate and appreciate God's commitment to justice, but that doesn't mean that we celebrate the loss of human life. Rather, we appreciate the gravity and the seriousness of what must be taken in order to reach that point where justice has been served. If we assume that Israel did not actually succeed in this instance, then I think we need to pray very carefully for justice to ultimately be served, for the hostages, of course, and their families who are probably very scared right now about what the next few days and weeks are going to hold, and for some ultimate end to this conflict, and not just a paper mache end to the conflict that puts a band-aid on this and kicks the can down the road, but something that actually creates a lasting and just peace. I think we need to be praying for that, because that is what should be the goal for an attack like yesterday. And if it didn't succeed, then obviously there is work to be done in creating that peace that we should be praying for.
Yeah, I'm reminded of King David when he heard the reports that King Saul have died. At this point, David was the anointed one, he was not the king. And then this young man comes in and comes up with this story like, hey, I just heard that I just came and Saul is dead. And David is like, how do you know? And the guy lies. He's like, I did it myself. And David is like, oh, who are you? And he's, I'm the son of an Amalekite. I'm talking about 2 Samuel chapter 1. And King David asked his young men to execute this guy. Because the guy thought, I just killed a bad guy. This is great things. And David's like, no, you shouldn't have done this. I'm reminded, I think we should have that approach. Of course, these guys who were targeted are not those anointed, are not King Saul. But I think that heart, David had the heart according to God's heart. He was not delighted. Even in the guy who was trying to kill him, he was not delighted that this guy died. So I'm reminded of Bible verses like in the Psalms. Actually, let me read first 2 Peter 3:9. It says that the Lord is patient toward you, not wishing that anybody should perish, but that all should reach repentance. So when we think about the death of these terror leaders, it's a tragedy because it is very likely that their eternal reality will be away from the Lord, because as far as we don't know, they're not Christians, they were not repentant believers, they were not trusting the gospel, and that's the end of all people. So first, sobering for us as Christians to hold to the gospel, to repent, to go to the Lord, to share the gospel with our friends. The reality of a terrorists like these guys who are targeted by a foreign army it's the same eternity for all of us if we don't repent and believe. We're all going to the same place if we don't repent and believe. So I think I want to highlight once again a passages in our statement of belief. We believe that all humans are fallen and we need Jesus Christ, who is the only hope for salvation. Also, I want to repeat James 4:13-5. James talking to people, he's saying, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such town, spend a year there and trade and make profit, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. These men were probably so secure because they were protected by Qatar, they're traveling in private jets, they have all the security around them, but they didn't know what tomorrow was going to bring. And again, that could be our reality as well. We don't know what could happen tomorrow. We don't know what's going to happen tonight. So I'm really just humbled by the reality of that death could come at any moment. And it's sad that these men are very likely never knew the gospel, never repented, but we can, and today you can, and I think we can have hope and find comfort that Jesus is sovereign, that the Lord is king, and that we can trust him for our salvation, for our security, and pray that for the wicked. Pray that the wicked will repent. Pray for the leaders of Hamas in Gaza. Pray that people give up terror. Pray for the families of the terror attack in Jerusalem, that they will heal, that the Lord will comfort them. I pray for the safety of Jerusalem. We're commanded, or the people of Israel were commanded to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Josiah, do you have any other concluding prayer thoughts?
No, I appreciate, Sebastian, what you shared. The scriptures are very encouraging. So thank you for grounding us in those and reminding us of those. That's very powerful.
It's a privilege, and I hope you guys appreciate that we get to talk about realities in the Middle East, and then we get to talk about the Bible, about the gospel, and pray about it, talk about the Bible. So thank you so much for sticking with us. Today was a longer episode because big event had happened this week, and we wanted to make sure that we gave you context. So thank you, Josiah, for looking into all this for us. We'll be back next week for another regular episode. Thank you to our producer, Lindsay and Avery. Thank you guys for listening to the Passages Pulse. We'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you liked this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.